Welcome to Decoding Leadership, where we break down the elements of humane and effective leadership. I'm your host, Jade Rubick. Today we're going to talk about a topic I call organizational work. Organizational work is work that you do on an organization. I call it organizational work to contrast it with project work. A lot of small companies, especially a lot of startups, are just very focused on getting things done. And I think this makes a lot of sense. It's appropriate in a lot of the earliest stages of a company. Before you really start scaling things, it makes sense to just focus on whatever needs to be done to get things out the door. But this doesn't create the machinery for delivering value. And as a company grows, it can end up slowing down and falling apart and almost like tearing itself apart by the pressures that are caused by not having that very important machinery in place. I think this concept of organizational work is actually a really critical one, and one that I'd really like to go into some detail today and talk about why I think it's important, how to use it to build a machine for value in your organization, and some kind of tips and tricks for how to leverage it to create strong teams and so on. So just to back up a little bit, like what do I mean by this organizational work? Well, we could take an example of how you do hiring. Typically, at the early stages of a company, when you do hiring, you reinvent the wheel every time you do it. You may have some sort of lightweight process, or you might copy something from the last time you hired somebody. But basically, every time you do it, you're kind of reinventing the wheel. And organizational work is about making it easier for the future. So you're not just solving your current problem, but you're actually doing work on the organization to make it easier for things to happen in the future. And so a good way to evaluate whether organizational work is happening is if you see ongoing efforts from your leaders continually to streamline the way things are going to happen in the future. So that's generally how I define organizational work. Do people have projects that are about making things better? When you identify things that just really aren't working, are you able to focus on those sort of things? I like organizational work for a couple of reasons. First of all, the leaders aren't just defining their role by getting stuff done, they're improving the way that things get done. And what happens when you have a continual focus on organizational work is that there's this kind of compounding interest or this compounding benefit that happens in the organization that becomes amazing over time. Over years, you see that a lot of things are just automatic. They happen very easily and with very little effort. Companies that continually invest in organizational work can become pretty amazing places to work. And alternatively, if you don't invest in this, think about how your organization changes over time. So as you grow, you're dealing with an increasingly complex environment. And the people in that environment are basically having to navigate something that is harder every year. It's harder every month to get your job done. What counters all of that complexity is organizational work. There's other ways to combat it as well. You can subdivide problems. There's a lot of other ways to do it. But I think organizational work is a really key lever to combating a lot of the complexity and the challenges of modern, large, complicated organizations. Another thing that I really love about organizational work is it's also a way to form a very strong management team. Typically, you will see management teams formed of loose bands of individuals that don't really have any shared problems to work on. They are all kind of responsible for their own areas. How do you really create a team of leaders when they're all working on their own things? And what I often find is that you see these leadership groups that act like a hub model, where you have the leader of that group that acts as the central communication channel for all of the people in that group. And this is problematic because the people within that group actually are not able to collaborate with each other. They're not able to learn from each other. They're not able to really work with each other. They all have their own fiefdoms. And while there is a value sometimes in subdividing your space and not like having a very complex environment you're dealing with and just focusing on your problems, when you are all working on organizational work together, you have a natural common cause, making the organization work better. And you have natural partners in that cause, people that can help you improve your plans, critique your plans, partner with you to try to like make things better. It creates this team of leaders that help make the job less lonely. They help accelerate your learning. And have found some of my best leadership experiences have been from groups that are actively working on the organization around them. And I think this concept of organizational work is a real foundation to creating strong leadership teams. So, when you have this concept of organizational work, one benefit of this is that you have a way to point people at problems. If you periodically are reviewing your situation and you're like, wow, my top 3 problems are XYZ, you have a natural team of people to work with on those problems. As a leader of leaders, what I will often do is I will come up with my own best thinking of the biggest problems to solve and potentially some ways that we might address those problems. I'll work with my team and say, hey, do we agree that this is the main things that need to improve? Like, what needs to change in the next 3 months or 6 months? Probably XYZ. And then I work with my leaders to basically have all of us sign up for whatever work we're capable of signing up for. And then the group makes proposals, critiques each other's proposals, reports on progress, helps each other out. Hey, I'm really struggling with this part of the plan. Anybody have any ideas? It becomes a natural place for all of your leaders to come together and work together on a problem. I have used this technique at times when there were major problems in an organization, and it was much more than I could do myself. I'm thinking of one example where I actually knew that I needed to hire an entire management team. There was no management team in place. I went out and deliberately hired people and told them that together we were going to be operating on this organization together. And we created this incredible management team that the 4 of us all took parts of the problem, worked on them, reported on them, and it became this very effective team. And it was actually a way to bring in some very talented people because they saw that they were going to make a difference in this organization. And so there were ways in which that environment probably wasn't like the best environment in every different way, but they saw an opportunity that they could do something meaningful together. And what kind of problems does a manager or a leader want to solve? They want to solve things that feel meaty, things that stretch them. And this is a way that you can often do that. Along those lines, I do view organizational work as a way to develop your leadership team. You can often use these projects as a way of deliberately giving people experience in areas that they don't have experience. You can give it to them in order to round them out or to grow them in specific areas. And so, for example, like if you have a leader that hasn't really done a lot of reorgs instead of me doing it directly, I would have them put together the plan and then have myself and their peers essentially critique it and improve it. And if you created a leadership team that has a high degree of trust, where everybody's helping each other out, where people aren't trying to show off, where people are sincerely interested in doing good work and learning from each other, it can be a wonderful environment for learning. I can think of a couple of examples where even though they didn't have a ton of experience and there was like little ways that I had to guide their work, they actually produced incredible results out of it. And it's been a way that I've been able to see sometimes people that are very high potential because they can just produce these really incredible results, sometimes even when they lack a lot of experience. So can be a tool for growing your leaders. It can be a way to deliberately train people. One challenge can be sometimes your managers will not have the bandwidth to take on additional work. Leadership and management often is all consuming, and often they may not have capacity to take on an additional project. And this might just feel like additional work to them. I think that's actually a really good signal, though. If your managers don't have the capacity or the time to make the organization around you better, you can be pretty certain that that environment is probably not going to change that much. Like, what are the odds that if nobody is focusing on improving the effectiveness of the organization, that it's going to get better? Can you be the only one that is focusing on that? Maybe, maybe not. So I think that's a really good signal. It is a risk to watch out for, and you do have to be realistic. Sometimes I've seen managers that it's just not a fair expectation of them. Sometimes managers that are new in the role, I'll explicitly carve out some space saying, look, this is something you will want to do later on, but the overhead of a new set of skills and managing for the first time is enough. You should focus on that. Usually the way I come up with the organizational work, like I said earlier, is I will think about the things that most need to change, and I will think of bets that will improve those. And we're constantly working on those things. So it could be around the development workflow. It could be around how we conduct hiring. It could be around how we communicate with Slack or with our wiki or whatever. It could be around teams that are hotspots and are challenged and are bottlenecks. Really, it can be most anything that's not project related. The way I like to think of this is that you have the work that the organization is doing, and then you have the machinery of that organization that is producing value. And those are both two different levels of things that you need to be paying attention to. And you can't completely focus on either of those. Like, it doesn't make sense to only work on projects because eventually that's not sustainable. It doesn't make sense to only work on the organization or the machinery because really you have to be generating value and you can't neglect the value that's being delivered. You have to make sure it's high quality. You have to inspect it, all of these things. I'd like to close by how to talk about organizational work. The way I was introduced to this concept for the first time, I had a VP of engineering named Bjorn Freeman Benson. He communicated it as you have two jobs. You have the job you were hired for, and you have a second job. The second job is to make things better around you, make things easier for the next person that does it. And you should be always thinking at these two levels of these two jobs. You can't only do the first job. You can't only do the second job. You have to do both. That's the expectation of being a leader here. I really loved that way of conveying it. I'm sure there's a lot of other ways you can communicate this. And weirdly, I actually haven't used that language myself. Maybe I should. The question I would leave you with is organizational work happening in your organization? Should it be happening? Would it benefit by having this notion of organizational work be a concept that people talk about. And also, if you've had any sort of parallel or related topics like this or concepts like this, I'd love to hear about it. Thank you.